Now, protests continue in the Armenian capital, Yerevan. Tensions are high, with demonstrators accusing the Prime Minister of not doing enough to help the ethnic Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan is claiming victory after its 24-hour military operation earlier this week, which resulted in a ceasefire where Armenian separatists laid down their weapons and handed it over to Azerbaijan. Now, reintegration talks held yesterday failed to result in any breakthrough, but Baku has announced it's sending humanitarian aid to the enclave, and Azerbaijan's president has promised to guarantee the rights of Armenians living in Nagorno-Karabakh. We can now bring in France 24's international affairs commentator Douglas Herbert. Doug, great to see you.
Hi, Delano.
Why are demonstrators in Yerevan so angry?
They basically are channeling all of their anger over what they see as the relinquishing of this enclave after 30 years of war and conflict to Azerbaijan. They're channeling all of their anger, all of their frustration in one man, and that is the Prime Minister of Armenia, Pashinyan, Nikol Pashinyan. And why? Because basically he is seen as, he's personified almost as the Antichrist. He is accused of treason. He is accused of abandoning Artsakh, which is the name that the ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh give to the enclave. They feel that he just stood there and failed to come to the aid in any way during that 24 hours when Azerbaijan was making its lightning military incursion, which led to ultimately the local Armenian separatists in Nagorno-Karabakh agreeing, or being forced to agree in a sense, in the face of overwhelming force, to disband, lay down their arms, and come to these talks that you just mentioned. So the frustration is there. They really think that their prime minister failed to uphold the interests, if you will, of their ethnic brethren in Nagorno-Karabakh, because we're talking about ethnic Armenians who have been basically in this enclave, claiming it as their own, sort of an ancestral homeland, the same way the Azerbaijanis have for the past 3 decades. And there was a point back in the 90s, as we know, when Armenia had won the early wars over Azerbaijan and really regained control of not just the enclave, but districts around it. And then that territory was almost entirely, mostly recaptured in the more recent 44-day war in 2020 by Azerbaijan. And so this is really seen as Azerbaijan completing that task and taking the entire enclave for itself. And what did the prime minister do? From their perspective, the protesters, he just stood there. That's why they're calling for his resignation. That's why they want to open an impeachment inquiry into him.
Doug, okay, so we had the protesters out on the streets who accused Pashinyan of essentially sitting on his hands, but surely some people must see that his hands were tied.
Yeah, and that's exactly the expression I was going to use. His hands being tied. He's in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Look, from Pashinyan's perspective, he believes that the best interests of his country are served in an environment of peace. He says Armenia, more than anything, needs peace. What it doesn't need, the last thing it needs, is more interregional and inter-ethnic conflict and violence. And that has been the lot between, essentially, through the proxies, Armenia and Azerbaijan over the past 3 decades, since the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse in the early 90s. There's been nothing but war, followed by sort of frozen conflict, followed by new eruptions of war, and enough, basically, from Pashinyan's perspective. What his supporters are saying, and it's interesting, he does have defenders, right? I know we're focusing on the protests because they're angry right now, they're virulent, their message is extremely strong, they want him to resign, but his supporters also see this as almost setting the way for stability, that they're warning of, if these protesters were essentially to be unsuccessful, their argument is, that is, if the protesters are not able to force Pashinyan to step down, dividing Armenia, it could actually bring, they fear, Azerbaijan into the equation to perhaps try to destabilize or unseat Armenia's leadership, Pashinyan, with Moscow's blessing, because let's not forget, Moscow, no love lost between Vladimir Putin and this particular leader in Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, who has had a pivot to the West of late, seen as very pro-Western. So in other words, the protesters, from the supporters' view, the prime minister's supporters, they see them as playing into the hands of Azerbaijan's interests and perhaps with Moscow's blessing.
Now, Russia is an ally of Armenia. It has been in the past.
Yeah.
Russia has a military base in Armenia, yet there's the anger on the street directed at Pashinyan is also directed at Vladimir Putin. Some people, in fact, calling Russia an evil empire and burning Russian passports.
Yeah, we've seen some burning of Russian passports. Both Putin and the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, being targeted with angry expletives in recent days in some of those protests. The Russian peacekeepers are seen as signally failing to do anything to safeguard the local ethnic Armenians during Azerbaijan's military onslaught a few days ago. They're seen as essentially standing by as well and doing nothing really to protect or to ensure that blockaded supplies, because the Lachin corridor, which had been essentially the only game in town for getting food and fuel and medicine through, in many cases, to the ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, that had also been blockaded by Azerbaijani forces. And the Russian peacekeepers, who were supposed to sort of, patrol and keep peace around that corridor and that area, did, at least from the Armenian perspective, did absolutely nothing. So they see Russia being as complicit. They see Russia as Putin is resentful of Pashinyan, as I was saying, for his tilt towards the West, for conducting joint military exercises with the U.S. recently, and perhaps tilting more towards Azerbaijan, which is an ally of Turkey, playing into geopolitical interests there for Moscow right now at a time when Azerbaijan, let's not forget, has oil, and lots of oil. It's very powerful and strategically powerful as well.
Douglas, thank you very much for that. Doug Herbert there.